Have you ever wondered what it means to exist? And if you do exist, does God exist as well? Today we delve into the crux of a compelling philosophical proposition, the ontological argument. This fascinating line of thought explores the very nature of being and existence. At the heart of the ontological argument is the proposition that God, being defined as the most great or perfect being, must exist. But it goes even further, suggesting that God's existence isn't just a possibility, but is logically necessary. Picture this, if you will, a being of such greatness, such perfection, that its very concept necessitates its existence. This isn't just about faith or belief, but about logic, reason, and the fundamental principles of existence. So, fasten your mental seatbelts and open your minds. Prepare yourself for a journey into the heart of philosophical reasoning. In the ontological argument, God isn't just any entity. He is considered the greatest conceivable being. Now let's delve deeper into this concept. The ontological argument suggests that God is not merely a higher power or a divine entity. Rather, God is the epitome of perfection, the ultimate being that one can conceive. The argument is built on the premise that existence in itself is a form of perfection. Therefore, the most perfect being, or in other words, God, must exist. To understand this, consider a painter envisioning the most beautiful painting. In the artist's mind, the painting is flawless, an embodiment of perfection. But does the painting exist? Not in the physical world, not yet. However, the moment the artist brings this imagined painting to life on canvas, it gains an additional layer of perfection. It exists. Similarly, in the ontological view, the concept of God gains perfection not just from his attributes of omnipotence, omniscience, and omnibenevolence, but also from his existence. This argument is deeply rooted in the idea of existence as a predicate, a quality or characteristic. Just as the quality of being red might be a predicate of an apple, existence is a predicate of God. However, it's not just any predicate. It's a necessary predicate, an attribute without which God wouldn't be the greatest conceivable being. The ontological argument takes a unique approach to the concept of God. It does not rely on empirical evidence or sensory experience. Instead, it uses pure reason to argue for God's existence. It proposes that once we understand what the concept of God entails, we will realize that God's non-existence is inconceivable. Remember, the ontological argument revolves around the concept of the greatest conceivable being. It's not about proving the existence of a higher power, it's about demonstrating that the greatest conceivable being, by definition, must exist. If we can conceive of the greatest being, then surely that being must exist. Let's delve into the logic behind the ontological argument. It's simpler than you might think. First off, the ontological argument is a philosophical debate about the nature of God's existence. It starts with the premise that the concept of God is one of a perfect being, the greatest conceivable entity. This being is so great, in fact, that nothing greater could possibly be conceived. It's a concept that exists in our minds and understanding. But here's where the argument gets interesting. If this greatest possible being exists in our understanding, then it must also exist in reality. Why, you ask? Well, if it didn't exist in reality, then it wouldn't be the greatest possible being. We could conceive of an even greater being, one that does exist in reality. This is where the ontological argument takes a logical turn. If the greatest conceivable being doesn't exist, then we could imagine something greater. But that contradicts our initial understanding of God as the greatest possible being. In other words, the very concept of God necessitates his existence in reality. This might seem like a bit of a mind-bender, but it's based on a simple logical progression. The argument doesn't require empirical evidence or sensory experience. Instead, it's grounded in our understanding and logical reasoning. It's important to remember that the ontological argument isn't about proving God's existence in a scientific sense. Instead, it's about understanding the nature of God's existence based on the concept of God as the greatest conceivable being. It's a fascinating exploration of how our understanding shapes our reality. This argument has been the subject of much debate among philosophers, theologians, and scholars. It's a testament to the power of logic and reason, and to the complexities of our understanding of the divine. So by this logic, the greatest conceivable being, or God, must exist in reality. Fascinating, isn't it? No argument is without its critics. Let's examine some of the critiques of the ontological argument. Delving into the realm of critiques, we encounter a multitude of perspectives. One of the most prominent criticisms stems from the philosophical camp that argues existence isn't a real predicate or characteristic. This claim, often associated with philosopher Immanuel Kant, suggests that existence doesn't add anything to the concept of a thing. For example, the concept of a unicorn is complete without asserting that unicorns exist. So, asserting that God exists doesn't add anything to the concept of God. Hence, the argument that God must exist because we have a concept of a perfect being, according to this critique, fails to hold water. Another critique comes from those who challenge the ontological argument's reliance on our ability to conceive of a perfect being. This critique proposes a hypothetical scenario. Imagine a perfect island, an island with all the qualities one could desire. If we follow the logic of the ontological argument, this perfect island must exist because it is greater to exist in reality than merely in the mind. But this conclusion seems absurd. Just because we can conceive of a perfect island doesn't mean such an island necessarily exists. Similarly, the argument goes, just because we can conceive of a perfect being doesn't mean such a being necessarily exists. These critiques, among others, stir the pot of philosophical debates about the ontological argument. They provoke us to question what we mean when we say something exists and what it means for something to be perfect. They challenge the assumption that our ability to conceive of something has any bearing on whether or not that thing exists in reality. In essence, these critiques do not aim to disprove the existence of God. Rather, they challenge the validity of the ontological argument as a proof of God's existence. These critiques challenge us to think more deeply about the nature of existence and the concept of God. We've journeyed through a fascinating philosophical argument today. Let's recall what we've learned. We began with an introduction to the ontological argument, a philosophical proposition that revolves around the concept of God's existence. We delved into the premise that God, as a perfect being, must exist by necessity simply because we can conceive of such a being in our minds. We then rolled up our sleeves to dissect the logic behind this argument. We explored how the argument makes a leap from the conceptual realm to the realm of reality, asserting that God's existence is not just possible but necessary. Next, we entertained the critiques of the ontological argument, where we encountered thinkers who challenged the leap from conception to reality, and others who questioned the very definition of a perfect being. Whether you believe in God or not, the ontological argument offers a fascinating perspective on the nature of existence. Remember to like, share, and subscribe for more thought-provoking content.